All right, we are back Thursday night, 11 p.m. Eastern. We've got Dunn.
What's
How's
up?
it going, Don?
How's
And we
everybody in
got
audio land?
We got the Matthew Poes.
We're not worthy. We're not worthy.
That's right.
So we are going to continue the talks about rooms, room acoustics, the ideal rooms that we started talking about with Anthony Gramani. We're going to keep this going, whenever we can, because I don't think people talk about the impact a room has on your sound system enough. They play around with their cables, but they don't actually try to optimize what's really important, and that's the room. So the question, I guess, I posed to Matt is there an ideal room? Should we be setting up our room like the ITU standard shows about how the speakers are placed all around, almost like in a circle with one primary listener? I mean, I guess it's great if you're in a studio, but how are you going to set up a room like the ITU when you have multiple rows of seats and you have multiple people coming in? Don, do you set up ITU size rooms?
Dude, those diagrams are the bane of my existence. I mean, there's certain parameters that you have to follow, but there's a lot of leeway on that. There's all kinds of, and being an integrator, I have access to all kinds of different solution-based speakers. So I have a little bit of flexibility in that, but it's really difficult. I guess your room's probably one of the great opportunities we had to do something that was almost ideal, because you don't mind seeing speakers on the wall and whatnot. But most people, they don't want to see anything. Most of my clients, they don't necessarily care about the diagrams. They care about, does it look good and does it sound good? So we have some flexibility on doing that. People think they know because they look at these diagrams and they talk on the forums and, I'm an absolute dude. There is so much flexibility on that, especially in ambient surround speakers to a point should be ambient. I mean, that's where I stand on it.
Yep.
Sure.
I hear you.
Well, and those rooms have a lot of other challenges in actually achieving, what there's more to it than just speaker placement. And Don, you and I were talking about this before. I mean, at the end of the day, most people don't want to spend the money it takes to achieve what's in those standards.
Absolutely. When you to do these deployments in a certain way, I mean, architectural speakers have come a long way too. Still to this day, people associate an in ceiling or an in wall architectural speaker with a lesser sound. Sometimes that's true, but they've come a long way in design and technology, in with subwoofers, like what JL does, what Focal does, and some of these companies. They're pretty amazing.
Yep. Especially when they have back boxes, so they have an acoustically controlled environment that they're playing in.
Correct. You have to have flexibility, because most of these are homes that people live in. Even if it's a media room, if it's a dedicated theater, that's kind of one thing. But the trend quite a bit for a while now has been like a multi-purpose media room with a sectional instead of theater seating, not necessarily a platform, maybe a bar in the background, which I'm a big fan of. So we can get excellent sound in there, but we still have to hide things. And that's the challenge as an integrator that we face.
Yeah. I think the other thing that we're going to talk about here is that, especially I want to start by saying, because for some reason, people keep messaging me like Anthony and I are like enemies and we fight with each other. Anthony's a friend of mine. Yeah. But, Anthony's been doing these presentations on how to treat rooms to get optimal results. And actually, a lot of people will point to some of the research that Floyd Toole has done in the book he wrote, or the books he wrote. Sean Olive has talked about this as well, right? And they'll note that he talks a lot about, what makes sense to treat, what, maybe doesn't need to be treated so much. And they'll kind of maybe think, well, isn't that too much? So here's how I look at it. First off, you shouldn't assume that if your room's untreated, your room sucks. That's not true. It's not uncommon for rooms to actually be pretty okay as is, especially if they're on the kind of modest to smaller size and they have reasonable furniture in them, carpet, things like that, some pictures on the walls. Those rooms can often measure pretty well and sound pretty decent. And treating them the way we've been showing is not an absolute must. The reason why you do what Anthony's showing is that you take a room like Gene's. There is no furniture in that room other than those chairs. And that room is a dedicated space with one purpose. There isn't a rug on the floor necessarily unless he puts one in there. And even if he does, it's only going to do so much. Instead, you've got basically a bunch of bare walls. And that's a room that's designed to do one thing and one thing only, sound good. So what Floyd Toole said, which is right, is that room has no excuse to sound bad. So in those rooms, you treat them, and you treat them a lot because you want to make sure that they do sound as good as possible. But that's because that room doesn't have anything in it to help it sound good. For a lot of normal living rooms where, I mean, Don, you deal with this. You walk into a living room, you say to the person, well, you could probably get a little bit better sound if you put some panels on this wall, some diffusers over here. And they're going to say, yeah, I don't want that. And the thing is, I get it. Like, I wouldn't want it either.
They look at you with a blank stare. Then they look at their wife and she's going. So, I mean, that's kind of what we run into. However, we do have a lot of tools at our disposal to kind of mitigate that a little bit now with the way speakers are designed. And some of the acoustic treatments now are actually artwork. They're beautiful.
Absolutely. Yep. And that's, I think, the trick now is kind of recognizing, what is necessary. A lot of rooms could benefit from a little bit of treatment, but they could be made to sound good with not too much. There are some rooms, though, dedicated rooms where, as I said, they got no excuses. They need to sound good, and you're probably going to be putting a lot into them. So this one is really, I think, going to focus on different aspects of what is the ideal listening room. But at the end of the day, I took this picture because I looked at it and I thought, this is not an ideal room from an acoustic standpoint, but it sure looks like a place I'd want to sit and listen to music. And isn't that the point of this?
The chair's facing the wrong way.
Is that Gutenberg's room?
No, this room is way too clean for Gutenberg.
It's too organized. Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, man. Been a long, strange trip, dude.
Yeah. So let's start with the standards that you talked about before, Gene. Yeah. So a number of standards exist. There's the IEC publication 26813 Sound Systems Equipment Part 13. It goes all the way back to 1985. It's a pretty dated standard. You've got NR12A, Technical Recommendations for Sound Control Rooms and Listening Rooms. Second edition, the Nordic Public Broadcasting Corporation. You've got the ITU, which this one gets cited a lot, and the one below it more so. The ITUR recommendations, BS 1116, Methods for Subjective Evaluation of Small Impairments in Audio Systems, including Multi-Channel Sound Systems, 1997. The BS 775 was the Multi-Channel Stereophonic Sound System with and without accompanying pictures. You've got the EBU Tech 3276 from 97 and AES 20 1996, obviously came out then. It's a recommended practice for professional audio subjective evaluation of loudspeakers. The names of these standards should actually tell you what they were designed for. And I've actually gone ahead and included pictures from rooms that were built to meet the standard. So I think there should be two key takeaways just from those pictures alone. I know the one is blurry. It was hard to get high resolution, but these rooms are clearly not a room I would want to spend time in, right? Like, they're not nice rooms, and they're not designed to be nice rooms. They're designed to be laboratories, and that's what the standards
testing lab. Yep.
And that's what the standards were for. So what are those standards? Well, that first one was really about evaluating distortions in loudspeakers, the IEC publication. So that was the ability to have, in this room, by the way, this is actually a recording studio. This is not one of those rooms, but it probably would meet the standard. So here's the way I kind of look at it. These were all designed to allow people to be able to listen to different systems and hear the smallest, faintest of problems with the system. So that you could detect problems in recordings. You could detect problems in the loudspeakers. You could detect differences, for instance, in the way surround systems are set up. And that is not how we listen to music. It's not even how we want to listen to music.
We don't want to have a room like that to listen to music.
No. And one of the things that those rooms often are somewhat devoid of is, in sort of subjective terms, it would be life, basically. But in actual acoustic terms, it would be spaciousness. So typically those rooms are made to be very quiet and very dry. The quiet's not such a bad thing, but the dryness isn't necessarily what you want in most rooms. They're a little bit too dry. So are these rooms good for you? Well, the standards have good targets for, well, I guess the question is, are these standards good targets for consumer listening rooms? And I think in some ways, yes, in some ways, no. But I think people need to think about this from the standpoint of what do they want? What do they value? And what kind of equipment are they using? So those rooms were designed, as I said, for evaluating equipment. Those rooms, and I don't mean like reviewers, I mean researchers. So I think the yes of it is there's nothing wrong with a really quiet room. The RT or RDT times are pretty low, but to be honest, they're not awful. And a lot of people would do that, especially intentionally for a home theater. So that's not such a bad thing. And in smaller rooms, you probably would be doing numbers like that. But, what if you're somebody like Floyd Toole has talked about this a lot. I'm not into music like this. He was really, really into like classical music, symphonic performances, and he'd like to have a room that spatially recreated the symphony. And so for him, he liked a lively room and omnidirectional loudspeakers. And he talked fondly about that. So in a room like that, you don't want an RDT of 0.2, 0.3 seconds. You want an RDT of 0.5, 0.6, 0.7 seconds, something much higher.
To add spaciousness, is that what that does, Matt?
Well, the spaciousness is going to come. So part of the spaciousness is going to come from the lateral reflections in the room. And what that higher decay time allows for is basically a longer amount of time that is essentially happening loudly. So you're hearing them over a greater period of time. And so those are rooms which are going to have more reflective surfaces in it. And in theory, if you could diffuse those quite a bit, but not really absorb them, the room would sound larger than it is.
So this kind of goes in line with what we were talking about with Anthony Gramani in one of the other acoustic episodes, where he was putting, absorption, alternating absorption and diffusion on the sidewalls. So
yeah, that caught me as like nutty when he said that. And I had to go look into it because I thought I can't believe this is right. So I did do some looking into it, and a bunch of people had said, well, it's probably right, but I don't know if it's a good idea. And then I actually recently discovered some research. I'll try to maybe bring it up at some point in the future so people can see it. It came out of, I believe it was the University of Washington, where they looked at how changes in the phase at each ear. So if each ear hears differences in phase, how that changes our perception of the size of the space that they're in. And what they found was the more dissimilar, basically, the phase was at each ear in the reflections, the larger the space was perceived as. And so from a treatment standpoint, that implies that adding a lot of diffusion to a room, put in the right location, could actually make that room sound bigger than it is.
I don't see any issue at all at bringing, once you get past that first reflection point and you're getting towards the middle of the room, having diffusers in that point. To me, it makes sense, actually. And I've started kind of thinking that way versus what I used to in the past.
Yeah, and that's actually where you'd probably want to put them. You could put them at the first reflection point, but to be honest, I would worry about it adding a phasiness to the sound that wouldn't be good. So if it's in the reflected area past the first reflection, so you're getting into second order and higher, definitely not a problem. First order, I think it's going to depend on how close those speakers are to that wall and how close you are to that wall. So if it's a really small room, personally, I wouldn't do that. I would probably stick more to nothing or maybe absorption if necessary. And it could be necessary. In really small rooms, sometimes the speakers are so close to the sidewall that it's a good idea to absorb.
What type of diffusers would you recommend in that type of deployment?
And that you can use different kinds. I mean, I think Anthony calls them 3D. The technical term used by the diffuser guys tends to be 2D, but the ones that diffuse in multiple directions are good when you're getting into second and third order because those reflections are coming from different directions. Whereas if you're trying to diffuse in a specific direction, an example of that would be ceiling. So if you're putting it on the ceiling, it's not uncommon, especially if you're doing it at the first reflection point, to use 1D or what Anthony calls 2D diffusers, which are only diffusing in one direction. So
I like that terminology, though, having a dry room and having a wet room. I mean, that's pretty, it makes sense. It really does.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's go back to the standard again really quick. So there's a number of issues with these standards. The Walker ratio refers to this idea that if you have the height, width, and length of the room at just the right ratio, it tends to spread out the modes. So anybody who's measured a lot of rooms knows that one of the biggest problems you have is the bass. And the bass tends to have a lot of peaks and dips in it. And so one of the things that can be helpful is, so you can imagine if you think of a dip, for instance, in the bass response as being like a PEQ filter. Let's just say for the sake of argument that every room mode has exactly the same Q and decibel level, but different frequencies. If they're really close to each other, like 100 hertz, 80 hertz, and 60 hertz, then you're just basically going to lose an octave plus worth of bass because they're going to combine together. So if you can spread them out farther, then they're not going to combine together as much and you don't lose quite as much bass and they can be easier to deal with. So the Walker ratio is this idea that if you get the right length, width, and height of the room, you can spread those modes out farther and they become easier to deal with and you don't lose so much bass, basically, that you have to try to get back. So the problem with that is, I mean, Don, you're an installer. How often do you get to dictate the length, width, and height of the room?
Pretty much never. I mean,
Never, yeah.
Well, I get to make strong recommendations, and sometimes that comes to fruition. But honestly, it's a design thing, and it's the structure, how it's built. You know that you're building a house right now. I mean, there's just certain limitations to it. So we have to work within. That's the phase one of the parameters we have to work in. Now we've got this room design. Where do we go from there? Is it going to have a soffit? How is it going to be constructed? Can we add things to the construction part of it to mitigate sound leakage into other rooms? Well, if we do that, we shorten the room. No, the client doesn't want to do that. I mean, do we have to build a baffle wall? You see what I mean? That's many factors add up to the end point on it, but rarely to answer questions. Rarely do I get to dictate. You know, I mean, at Gene's we kind of had some leeway to do that.
But Gene, you were, if I recall, you were constrained by the size of the pre-existing space that you were working within, right? That was supposed to be a garage, I think, in the original
the house.
Yeah, it was it was a 1-car garage and a bonus room, and I kind of combined the two together.
So there were limits to what you could do, because I ran both of our rooms because I was curious. So one of the things I said here is often achieving this is dumb luck. So I'll tell you guys, when I was designing my room, I did not think about this that much because I had to work within the constraints of the house platform itself. And so I did a little bit think about it, but not that much, because at the end of the day, if I fussed around with it too much, I was going to have to pay extra money basically to get the room that size. But mine barely met the criteria, and I ran yours, Gene, and it didn't meet the criteria.
Well, so what Gene and I did is we actually found some pagan priestesses and we sacrificed a goat.
Yeah, so you're going to be okay now because of that.
So the audio gods will be with us. That's now the AC's not so good, but.
Yeah. Well, so the point of all this, though, is that, I mean, Gene, you couldn't really change the dimensions that much to have fixed this. I was trying to figure out what you would have had to have done. You would have needed taller ceilings, basically.
Well, and we added that closet to it because we had no choice.
Yeah, and in my case, the room's smaller, and that's how I ended up managing to meet it. So then there's the RDT, and I said that's a very personal thing. So at the end of the day, how dry or wet the room is really depends a lot on what you listen to and what you like, and to some extent what kind of speakers you have. So as I said, Floyd Toole talks, he like waxes poetic often about this room he used to have in Canada in one of his houses. That had a pretty high RDT time, and he liked omnidirectional speakers, and I think he called it like his personal symphonic hall or something like that.
What, like for mains or like surround?
It wasn't surround. It was a stereo system, and he liked, and it used omnidirectional speakers. I think from Mirage or something like that.
Oh, really? Wow,
a long time ago.
Yeah, it was. This is old stuff.
Well, Canada, so that makes sense.
Yeah. And so anyway, the point is, he's not the only one like that, though. I know a lot of people like that, and that's just their preference. Now, is that my preference? No, I tend to go completely the opposite way. I tend to like dry rooms. I like controlled directivity speakers. I don't like as strong lateral reflections. It's a personal preference. And so there is, when I get into a room and I measure it, I've actually, oddly enough, had a bunch of these lately. So I've got about 10 clients right now I'm working with this month. And I've got one, he's got a room where the RDT is about 1.8 seconds on average, which, Don, you probably know that's extremely high. Gene, you too. That's not normal. No. I think I showed both of you the curve too. I mean, it's an unusual curve. I've got another guy I recently measured. His room is 0.8 seconds. That's actually pretty high too. It's not 1.8 seconds, but it is still higher than normal.
Well, you remember our conversation the other night, Matt, about you can lay and design something out, but there's always the short game, the putt, you know what I mean? Doing that last few tweaks to the audio, that really makes the difference. Just like you're building a crossover, you can design something on a computer, but you still have to tweak it. It's the same way with a room. I really, truly believe that you have to have that human touch at the last part of a room to eke out the best sound. I mean, that's my experience.
Well, and with these rooms, I'm not targeting a number with them per se in the traditional sense. Like, I'm not going in and saying, well, I want to meet the ITU standard. I'm going to get this room down to 0.3 seconds. You're looking for a sound. I am. And in part, it's because that room, I mean, Anthony and I had a conversation about that 1.8 second room, because when I measured it, I'm like, I don't know what I'm going to do with this room. It's never going to be a 0.3 second room or a 0.2 second room. The room is too big and too reflective. And the thing is, it's because of its volume, it doesn't actually need to be that dry. It will sound very similar to a smaller room that's very dry just by getting it down to around 1 second. So my goal for that room is actually get it to around 1 second. And that's pretty normal. And if you look at these standards, people that are familiar with it, they'll know the RDD times, actually, the target ones tend to vary with room size. So classrooms, for instance, you target higher numbers. Obviously, symphonic halls, you target way higher numbers. And it's actually as much volume as it is the sound effect you're trying to get out of that room. So as I said, it's very much a personal choice. It's very much volume dependent. And that 1.8 second room, I'll be happy if I get to 1 second. And that 0.8 second room, I'll be happy if I get that down to 0.5 seconds. If I go into somebody's little kind of closet sized home theater, I'm probably going to be shooting for 0.2 seconds because it's too small and I'm going to need to be able to get it down enough to sound right for surround sound. So, you target different numbers for different size rooms.
I keep going back to this picture that you have up now with this room where the speakers are all pointing to that center speak. I mean, that's something that looks like what Dolby puts out, but that's so hard to achieve in the real world. I mean,
so you're telling me you don't put up that trusses like that for people?
Well, only gold flake painted ones. We do. I mean, they have to be fancy, but no, we don't. But we can kind of get close to that using directional in ceiling speakers. Remember when I was telling you we had a conversation the other night? They make an in-ceiling speaker called a DT. It's a dual voice coil. It's a single speaker that plays stereo, but you can wire it in such a way that it'll play like almost like a bipole. A lot of times on my Atmos, I take those speakers and I angle them in such a way so they reflect off the wall and expand that out. And I found that that's made the Atmos deployments that I've done more spacious and sound more realistic. I even shared that with clips. They're like, yeah, that's a pretty good idea. Yeah, I mean, that does not need to be. The room acoustics are as important as this, or more important even than this deployment or speaker placement.
Sure. So in this room, this is a very large room at I think it's University of Surrey. The typical suggestions for these rooms is 3,000 to 6,000 cubic feet. So Gene, your room, I consider your room to be a large theater. It's 5,000 cubic feet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
it's pretty. Yeah.
Yeah, my old theater was a modest 2,500 cubic feet. My new one's going to be a still modest 3,300. I mean, that's pretty normal size, though, right?
Yeah, yeah. To me, Gene's room's ideal for it's big enough where it's not crowded or you don't feel constrained, even with the darker colors that he's put in. But it's also, relatively intimate. It's a comfortable room. To me, it's about the perfect size room. It's someplace I would want to go hang out and play video games or watch my movies or listen to my gangster rap or my death metal. You know what I mean? I dig it.
Yeah, but the point is, for people who are trying to achieve rooms like this, that's a big space to give up, and not everybody.
It is. It's that's usually a wealthy man or somebody that has a big basement. In Florida, we obviously don't have basements, but all of you that live
north, you have to swim in them.
Well, yeah, you have to swim in them eventually, but having a basement's great. I mean, what an ideal location to put a theater and set up. But usually it's people.
They're not as ideal as people think. I got to say that we should cover this sometime, but there's an issue with basements.
Too rigid. Yep.
They're very rigid, and it causes basement problems. So Gene, your room's, like I said, your room's pretty big. Do you think you could get away with those Genelec speakers in your room and actually hit reasonable loudness levels?
It depends on how many you have. I mean, if it's just like a 7.1, no.
Yeah, no, a typical 7.1. Even this system wouldn't actually hit THX levels.
No, definitely not to what I'm accustomed to with having a flagship.
Well, you think?
Yeah.
You could put that. You could run a Metallica concert with those RBHs, dude.
Yeah,
they're massive.
Yeah. So, but the point is that for people who are putting rooms that are that large together, everything scales up, right? Your subwoofers have to be bigger and more capable. Your speakers have to be bigger and more capable. And so, that's something that you have to kind of recognize. In fact, from a THX standpoint, their largest standard really didn't allow speakers to play loud enough in rooms that were that big or bigger. And so they actually had to come up with this new THX Dominus standard. Dominus. Of which there is one brand per listen that is able to produce a speaker that can do that right now. I mean,
do you know about that brand?
I do.
They're great. Okay, I was just curious. Yeah, we're all kind of lusting for these new per listen speakers. They're pretty incredible from what we're seeing.
Yeah, we got a review in the pipe. It should be a month or so.
I mean, they ain't cheap.
They're not, but they're a really good speaker, and I think they're probably a good price for what they are. So
they play like horn, like dynamics, like a horn loaded, but actually have good smooth sound.
Yeah, they're basically like an audiophile speaker capable of hitting high. Yeah,
right.
So
140 dBs.
Not that loud, but yeah, it's very loud. So the last thing I want to mention here is the noise floor. So they talk about NR15. It's sort of like having a A-weighted SPL scale that's around 15 dBs. So, you know, a lot of you are probably pulling out your SPL meters and saying, oh, mine is like 35. That's actually your SPL meter. Most people don't have an ability to measure this low. Actually, the sort of standard microphones that we all use in the industry for room calibration typically can't do any better than around 20 or 25. The better ones, I have one that's a little bit better that can do around NR 15 to 17 at best. Really, to measure this or lower, you have to get a very specialized mic. They cost at least $3,000-$4,000 typically on up, and that's just the mic part of it. There's more parts that are needed to make this all work. So the point is, it's hard to measure it, but even if you could measure it, to build a room that quiet is extremely difficult, especially having it be that quiet with the air conditioning running or the HVAC running.
Yeah, that's difficult. And that's something we'll have to do a live stream on, is the ancillary pieces to a theater room. Like you and I talked about the AC. Mm-hmm. What room you're watching a quiet place and all of a sudden the air conditioner comes on. I mean, it kind of kills your buzz when it does that. And that's something people don't think about when they're doing theater rooms, but I digress.
I don't know. I mean, I could talk endlessly about this topic because it's something I'm into, but I will say, I think a lot of people also way underestimate what it takes. If you really want to do a soundproof theater, but you want to make sure it has good air turnover, which I think is important.
Be careful with the word soundproof. That's a heavy word.
But there's no such thing as soundproof. I get it, but you know what? Right. We all use the term, so it's fine. So if you really want to have this room be very quiet and you don't want sound going in and out, the HVAC is a weak link. And the problem is, if you go with one of the sort of standard approaches people do, is what's called a dead vent. Gene actually technically has a form of dead vent in his room, but your room does have air turnover because of the way it was designed.
Yeah.
So, and no diffusers.
Yeah, but some people do have dead vents in their room that are purpose-built. So are they good for isolating? Absolutely. The problem is they're not great for ensuring enough air turnover. And these rooms tend to be like awful places for mold growth and things like that, especially when they're in basements. So having high air turnover can make the room much more pleasant. But when you have a room set up to ensure that there's enough high air turnover like that, then you end up having a lot of air noise, and you've created a pipe basically that runs from your theater to the whole rest of your house. So how do you separate it out?
All right, we're getting off on a tangent here because you and I, we talked about this for 2 hours the other night. No, but seriously, we need to do an actual video on that, because also media and theater rooms run hot because there's usually equipment inside of them, and projectors and several bodies at one time. And most of the rooms that I do, I try to heavily emphasize with the contractor that we have additional tonnage to fire into that room, because they get hot, and that kind of ruins the thing. If you're in there and you're sweating and it's not comfortable, I mean, that's a big part of it. So, but it
is a separate topic. The last thing I'll say about it is it's very expensive to fix. It's probably
not. Yeah, I agree.
All right. So what should you do? Well, as someone who's built multiple listening rooms that come close or do actually meet these standards like that of ITU, it takes big money to meet those requirements. So I'm showing pictures of my room and actually somebody else's room. I think one of those is just one I found on the internet, but the other 3 are from my last room. And I have built a couple that were actually designed to meet the standard, and it took big money to ensure that it would meet the standard, especially the noise floor. That was a big cost issue. There's really no research that tells us which rooms give the most realistic reproduction of sound. So, I think a lot of people try to point to all these different studies. Nobody ever sat down, built 5 different rooms, or made a room that was acoustically adjustable and then sat listeners in there and put them under some sort of blind condition and had them rate the rooms and then say, these are the conditions that make for the best sounding room. That study's never been done, and it probably never will be. It would be very difficult to do that. I mean, could you imagine coming up with like a room switcher?
You want to hear some really real world stuff? We've done rooms where we've done the higher end Odyssey calibrations, in years past, and set it all up and really dialed it in and been so proud of ourselves. Then had the client come in and say, this doesn't sound that great. I can't hear the rears, or I can't hear that. That's happened so many times. It's also happened to me with video calibration. Like, it's too dark. I can't see it. It's not so, I mean, we can talk about this till the cows come home, but it's all about what each room sounds like because they're all different.
Yeah. And I think you're getting at an important point, which is at the end of the day, this is a person's room and that person
Bingo.
has to enjoy it. And the whole purpose of this is to enjoy movies, enjoy music, and really, have it bring you joy and get into it. If it's not, then what's the point? So if you don't like the room, if it's not the sound you're looking for, then that's not the room for you. Trying to hit some sort of an artificial target doesn't really make sense. And so I think even for those of us that design rooms, what I think is important is spending some time talking to the person and saying, how do you use this room? Or how do you plan to use this room? What do you listen to? What's your favorite music? What's your favorite movie?
Oh, what you just said is so accurate. I just got to tell this real quick story, and I apologize.
Mm-hmm.
But like in 2003, I was working at a very high-end audio video shop, and this guy came in and he bought Wilson Watt puppies. He bought Lexicon preamp, Lexicon. I mean, he bought this really badass high dollars. I mean, it was a $100,000, sale, and we set it all up. We get it all set up. We got it. We're all proud. We got the Wilsons. First thing he does is he puts on Van Halen and cranks it. I mean, he's like, man, I thought it would play louder. I'm like, oh my God, dude. I didn't listen to what he wanted. He'd probably been happy with clips or some kind of horn loaded. He didn't care about sound quality. He just wanted volume. And he thought spending $14,000 on a set of left and right speakers would satisfy that. And they're not built for that. So you're so right with what you said. And I'm sorry to seize that.
No, it's an important point. And that comes from the standpoint of somebody who's designing rooms. But for those of us who are watching these videos and saying, well, I'm not going to hire somebody to design my room, I think you got to do that for yourself. Take a second to think, how am I going to use this room? What do I enjoy? What do I listen to? And
right.
you need to pick a room that meets that standard for you so that you can be happy with that space, especially because this is very expensive to do.
Yeah, if you're pulling bong hits and listening to Smelly Cat on your LP, you don't need a speaker that plays 120 dBs. Sorry, Steve. But if you're, most people like to listen. What people want more than anything is clear dialogue. That is the single biggest complaint that I ever get.
Yeah, it's true. So what's the best listening room? Your room. And this is going back to that idea that at the end of the day, this has to be a space that you want to be in. I know I keep saying that, but I think it's pretty important that people don't get too hung up. I mean, I see we do this on the forums and it's terrible. It's like benchtop racing or desktop racing. It's like people are arguing, well, I have 4 bass traps. Well, I have 6 bass traps. It's like, I don't care how many bass traps you have. Do you enjoy it? Are you having fun in there?
I got 9 inches of bass trap.
There you go. 9 inches of bass trap. So any room you want to spend time in is a good listening room. And that's, I think, an important point. Many of the requirements of the standard listening rooms can only be achieved through custom from scratch construction, which is just not realistic. I mean, again, how often do we have opportunities to do that? Very rarely. Standard listening rooms are not necessarily optimal for listening to all types of music. So again, these rooms were not designed for listening to music. They were designed for assessing whether there are problems with recordings, speakers, amplifiers, things like that. They were designed to be essentially microscopes for looking at the products.
Right. And they're somewhat fatiguing, to be honest with you. If you've spent much time in a recording studio with monitors in that kind of environment, it can be very fatiguing. It really can.
Yeah. Well, and I've grabbed a bunch of recording studios actually that were built to some of the current different standards to make a point, which is that even recording studios are built to different standards or often are built in different ways to achieve the same results.
Right.
Every one of these. Go ahead.
So wouldn't they have one that's more precise, so you can correct things in the sound, then another one as they do the final mix and to be a little bit more spacious, how it would sound to people in the real world. Then they can take that precise recording and make changes to it based on that. To me, that would seem ideal.
So actually, Newell says that in one of his books, and I need to remember to stay close to this mic. So Newell says that in one of his books, and I think that's spot on. The way that you want to listen to, I've heard some engineers tell me that actually they're so good at this that they don't need to go back to the normal room. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. There isn't enough research, and I would suspect that's not true. And it's, they just want to pat themselves on the back. But what the room that makes sense to really hear all the problems in the recording is going to be a room that doesn't have really any reflections in it, because those will be a distraction. And you're going to want to be able to listen really carefully. It needs to be very, very quiet, very dry, reflection free.
With a scalpel.
Yeah, and that's what the room is. But that's not how it's going to be listened to in real life. And it isn't necessarily how it should be listened to either. I mean, that's another mistake I think people make. So in reality, the room should be a lot more spacious than that. There should be reflections in it. And that's much more natural. Go ahead.
Well, isn't that what THX does? So don't they master the soundtracks in editing suites, then they take it like the Stag Theater and play it in this large theater environment and then do additional final calibrations on it. I mean, I think that's how that rolls there.
Could be. I have no idea what THX does. I think they like to keep
Anthony probably would be the guy to ask. Yeah. Well,
yeah, he worked for them for a while. So yeah, anyway, the point is that these studios are all done differently, but there are experts who would argue that actually there shouldn't be one mastering room. There should be more than one. And I've talked to people who tell me what they do is they have their mastering room like this. That's their scalpel room. They use it to do the initial mastering. They take it home. They listen to it in their own home system, or they'll have another room in the studio that's basically just a normal room set up with normal speakers. And that's their way of checking how it sounds in a more typical room that's more spacious. And I think that makes a lot of sense. But it should tell people something, which is that your room shouldn't be a studio. Your room should be a real room, and it should sound like a real room, because that's actually going to be the more accurate, natural way of reproducing music.
I mean, Keith Yates gave me years and years ago at a training, to me, the best analogy, and it really stuck in my mind to this day. He said, when you're in a media or theater room, when the lights go down and the movie starts, the walls should disappear and you should be completely transported into the world of the director and the sound designer on it, that the walls should disappear. And if you're on the deck of a sailing ship and there's sails in the wind, it should sound like sails in the wind. And that's always stuck with me. And if you over dampen a room, you lose that. So that precious energy, as I've talked to Anthony about that needs to be dealt with. Your surrounds need to be spacious to achieve that. I don't know any way spatially other than that to do it.
For sure. So we're going to get into some technical details now on you're fine, on targeting rooms. And so as we do this, I just want to mention that this is now getting more into if you really want to start tuning a room to somehow be more ideal, and you want to start following some of the concepts that are in those standards, that's what this is about. But I'm not suggesting people need to go out and do this. So the first thing to understand is that there is, in fact, a synergistic relationship between room and speakers. So I've talked about this a lot before, but a speaker's directivity is very important in that the way that speaker's directivity behaves in a given room is going to affect how it sounds to us. And so you could have a room that has very wide dispersion, but if the room is, for instance, very, very large, it may sound more similar to a speaker that has narrower dispersion in a smaller room. And similarly, a room that has first reflection absorbers with wide dispersion speakers could sound basically the same as a system that has narrow dispersion speakers and no absorbers, because they're both doing the same thing. They're weakening the lateral reflection. So there's a relationship between those two, and you have to kind of understand that when you're getting into designing a room, especially when you start targeting these different things. So RDT, the standard typically says it should be somewhere between 0.2 and 0.5. So when people are looking for clear dialogue, I'll just say if the RDT is above 0.5, dialogue tends to be very hard to hear and clearly understand. That's why home theaters, we typically want to see a lower number. But at the end of the day, for music, that may not be true. We don't care about dialogue clarity if we're listening to something like, again, a symphony. So symphonies tend to be in rooms that have much, much higher RT60 times to them. And so it's desirable to have it be higher. So at the end of the day, it's subjective. It just depends on what you're trying to do. There's this argument that there should be a good sized gap between direct sound and the first reflections. It's called the initial time delay gap, or ITD. And we measure for this when we're setting up rooms. We like to try to set them up so they do this. I usually build rooms to be able to achieve this. It's basically you want to be about minus 10 dBs over the first 10 milliseconds or so after direct sound. But this requires treatment typically, or a fairly large room to be able to achieve this. My guess would be if you've got a typical living room and you've got your speakers up against a wall, you're not achieving this. The room should be quiet, but at the same time, we tend to listen through the noise. So it's good that the room is quiet. That helps. It improves dynamic range. And at the same time, most people don't have particularly quiet rooms and they don't notice any problems. The room should either get out of the way or mimic the live acoustics. It depends. So there's two ways to treat a room. You can either make the room pretty dead, and then, so basically, I'm not saying turn it into an anechoic chamber, but you put a lot of absorption into the room. This is the idea of a room that gets out of the way. And then how do you recreate the actual acoustic space of the recording? You use an up mixer and surround sound. And basically the room won't sound good with 2-channel unless that's what you like. On the other hand, you can make the room try to recreate the spaciousness of the original recording, which is sometimes called spatial support acoustics. And that's more like what Anthony's been describing, where you're putting a mix of absorption and diffusion on different places around the room. And Don, as you were mentioning before, putting diffusion more in the back half of the room tends to be consistent with that idea.
I agree.
So I think that there's, I'm going to call it conflicting quotes, but actually one of them, I couldn't find the exact source of it, but it's like one of them is this: what we need is to make the sound appear to be coming from the live space by suppressing the early arriving reflections from the walls of the control room so that the sound engineer hears the ITD from the larger live space. So what this is saying is we need to make a small room, like a control room, sound like a really large performance space by basically doing special diffusion and absorption of the room. And then there's another quote that I got from an Ambisonics paper that says, anyone who believes they can recreate the live space of the acoustical event with 2 speakers in a small room accurately is deluding themselves. And that's this notion that it doesn't matter how you treat the room, it's never going to sound like the live space because it's just too small. You know, like no matter how much diffusion you've got going on those side walls, it's not going to sound as big as a symphony. And in my experiences, that's true. There's only so much you can do. All right, so to avoid some confusion, RDT and RT60 are functionally the same thing. The measurement is identical, and the targets for these are set, but they're in fact both taste and music dependent. So livelier rooms tend to be referred to for, they're preferred for 2-channel, especially when musical tastes run towards large symphonies and natural recordings. Larger rooms have higher RDT times in general than small rooms. So if you've got a really big space, you're going to target a higher number. The IAC, ITU, and AES room standards established are conjecture-based. In other words, there wasn't research that said that was true. There was some research that had said that people found those types of rooms easier to hear dialogue clearly and things like that. So it was just basically this idea that, well, if that's true, probably it's easier to hear distortions. But it wasn't a standard that was set because it sounds better with music. That nobody's ever researched that. Higher RDT times means livelier rooms are more spacious and bigger sounding.
So we should probably do a video in the future on how to measure the RTD time in a typical room, because people, you know, we keep talking about this, but nobody really knows if they want to figure this out for themselves.
Well, and you're going to get these hard-nosed guys that are going to say, oh, you got to go get an omnidirectional dodecahedron speaker and you got to stick it in the room in a couple locations and you take this. And then you've got Anthony and I actually have the same view on this, which is you don't really need to do that. You can use your standard speakers for it to understand what it's like. It's very infrequent that people will use the dodecahedron.
It's about what people are willing to pay for. I mean, let's talk about the reality. Most people that have big rooms like this pay somebody to install them. And it's a matter of what we can do with the budget. Unless you're doing something yourself, then even if you're doing it yourself, it's a sizable investment.
The dodecahedron speakers to buy that are used for this, and they do have to meet certain standards. So you can't just like build one and it's good enough. It actually has to be have a certain frequency response and shape to work. It has to be able to play really loud, like between 120 and 130 decibels is typically the level you'd like to see coming out of those things. So they're about $4,000 to $6,000. So, and it serves no other purpose than this.
Huh.
All right. I just wanted to go out on a limb and say, I love this shit. I'm so glad to be here, part of this. I love it. Matthew is a savant, dude. This guy is a super genius. I wish people knew the amount of knowledge you have. And Grimani too. I mean, you guys are like super freaks on this, man. And we're giving this information out. Come on.
And our slide presentations are all on our Patreon channel. So if you guys want to download this and go at your own leisure, patreon.com/audioholics.
This is the kind of training we get as professionals, and Audioholics is providing that. I mean, am I right, Matt? I mean, this is
absolutely.
This is CEDIA. What people don't even know what CEDIA is, but this is what professionals get trained on. And so I think it's awesome. I wish more people would realize what we're doing and pay attention to it.
Yeah, I think that I try to express this, and I think I probably confuse people though. But like with groups, I don't want to pick on CDIA because I don't really know exactly how they do this.
Well, come on.
With some of the trainings that are provided, you know this, Don, they give you like standards instead of explaining. They don't explain the theory. They just say it should be this. That's what you should do. And the problem is if the room doesn't meet the standard that concept came from, then you're going to follow a standard that doesn't make sense. So ITD is a good one. Like when you're designing a room, again, going back to what I was saying about Gene's room has no excuse to sound bad because it has one purpose in life, and that is to sound good.
But we're going to, I mean, Anthony's provided amazing sound, wall treatments for it, but we're going to have to tweak it out. So I say we set it up, we measure it. And if there's something in the measurements or the sound, more importantly, what Gene's ears hear that we don't like, then we can mix and match and move things around. That, I mean, that's the real world final piece of it that I keep emphasizing that, nobody really listens to. It's the final portion of it. It's the knowledge that does it.
Well, yeah, you're absolutely right. And one of the things we're going to look at in our measurements is this initial time delay gap. And one of the things is, as I said, there's this standard that says, well, it should be roughly minus 10 dBs for 10 milliseconds. Well, the minus 10 dBs makes sense because that is the point at which the sound, the reflections, if they mix with the direct sound, are only causing it's about a quarter of a decibel or less of change in level. So we're not going to hear those. But the 10 millisecond thing, where did that come from? Well, it's mostly conjecture, to be honest. It's not totally clear where that, it's really going to be room size dependent, to be honest. That a longer one might make sense in larger rooms. I said 3 milliseconds. I probably would guess you would not want that. That's a little too short. But my point was nobody ever really studied this carefully to figure out exactly what the right amount was. It was more based on trying to make these small rooms that didn't perform like larger rooms tend to perform more like larger rooms. If you go into a really, really large space and you set up a pair of speakers and you measure it, you're going to always have a pretty long ITD. But you go into any normal home room, any small room like a living room, a bedroom, even a theater as big as Gene's, it's not uncommon to see this actually be pretty bad where you've only got about 3 milliseconds of clean space. Or I mean, I measure plenty of systems that don't even have that. There's a strong reflection coming in as soon as 1.5 milliseconds, almost right away. And that's a problem. So what you tend to do is move the speakers, move equipment around that are causing those reflections. You redirect reflections is a really common one, or you absorb. And we could do something on this later, but you got to remember, absorbers are not perfect absorbers. Floyd Toole actually had a picture of this once where he showed what an actual reflection off of an absorber looks like, and it's awful. It's not a good response. And so you do want to be careful when designing rooms and trying to improve this that you don't make things worse, because those early things can be very problematic if the response is very different. The spectral energy is very different from that of the direct sound.
So Matthew, can I? I'm sorry to keep butting in, but
go ahead.
I'm rude. So one of the things that we tried in years past, and somebody told me how to do this, is when we were doing it, we used to do quite a few 2-channel rooms, and we did acoustic treatments, and we did bass absorbers and whatnot, and diffusers. Is what we would do is we would take a set of open back headphones and let a client listen to a track on those. Then we would play the same track in his room and have his opinion and comparisons on how he wanted it to sound. Did it sound better? Did it sound worse? And then we added treatments accordingly to try to achieve that. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. There's really a lot of ways to achieve this. And so here I've got some pictures that are showing what the measurement looks like when it's bad versus good. That bad measurement is actually better than what I've seen on a lot of rooms, and it's still pretty bad. So treatment is the way to fix this. There's lots of ways to do it. But Don, you and I were talking before about how important sometimes it is to figure out ways of treating rooms using normal things like bookcases, pictures, stuff like that.
Furniture, absolutely.
Furniture, yeah. And this is one of the things you're going after, is how can you use pretty normal surfaces in a room to help do this. That diffused reflection piece after about 20 milliseconds that you see here, that's one of the really important parts where you can use good treatment. Like in Gene's room, we're not going to put up bookcases. Gene, I'm assuming you don't want bookcases in your theater, right?
No, not in the theater room for sure.
Yeah, but in your living room, if somebody said to you, "Can we fill the room with diffusers?" You'd probably say, "Can we put bookcases in here?"
Bookcases actually work very well. I mean, they really do.
Yeah.
They do, but again, it's more about what makes sense in that space. So anyway, going back to this, the thing that causes these problems, everything that's going on in that first 10 to 20 milliseconds are what are referred to as very early reflections. And especially that stuff in the first 5 milliseconds is what you see in smaller spaces that are not optimally set up, are very, very early reflections. And they're problematic in the sense that they're typically as strong as the direct sound. There may be only a dB or two less, if that. And on top of that, they're coming from very close to the speaker, but they're often coming from non-ideal spaces. So if it's coming from behind the speaker, it doesn't tend to have a lot of negative effects, that front wall. But you still like to absorb that. It's a good wall to absorb on. If it's coming from immediately next to the speaker, so we're not talking about the typical first reflection points, but the stuff that's like immediately next to that wall, that tends to be problematic. It tends to cause the speaker to kind of sound wider than it is. You know, I got to say again, if you like symphonies, it probably would make the symphony sound larger, and that might be a good thing. If you like if you like Van Halen, you're not going to like that effect.
Well, absolutely.
So anyway, the point is this is typically done with absorption and diffusion. It's done in a certain way. Redirecting is another common thing that's done in studios. Most people in their homes are not comfortable with the redirection method. Literally means you're putting like ramp shaped things around the speaker to send the sound in different places, and then it's diffused or absorbed. Most people are not cool with that. All right, so which surfaces should be treated? I was mentioning these are first reflection points typically, but it's not just most people think of first reflection points as the things on the sidewall. There's a lot of other first reflection points. That just means first order reflections, things that have only bounced off one wall before they hit your ear. So there's a lot of those. And typically what you want to be dealing with are the things that are the wall behind the speakers, the sidewalls to a point, but I would just say only if the speakers are very close to the sidewalls and the room is pretty small. Otherwise, you can leave the sidewalls alone. And the ceiling, the ceiling's a big one actually. You do typically want to treat that to help improve this. So again, I'm going to go back really quick. Oops, went the wrong way. Well, what did I do? There we go. All right, so here you can see the ceiling again that's in there. I mean, that's very common that you're going to see a sidewall and a ceiling reflection that are very close together. So treating the ceiling is important. But moving on. Noise floor. So Gene, you were teasing me about what I achieved in the last room. I mean, remember, Gene, I had probably between 10 and 15 feet of mufflers on my HVAC system on both the return and supplies. I had anywhere from 2 to 4 layers of drywall. I had hat channel, green glue, had double stud walls everywhere, insulation. It was an unusual room, 2 doors, and it was in a basement. You know, again, so the bad thing about basements is that foundation is very rigid. It causes basement.
So was that a good room to put your victims in?
Yeah, I mean, people used to walk into that. When the inspectors came into that room, they were just like, "What is this for? Like, do we need to worry about you?" And a lot of people do build theaters like that. This one was probably taken up a little bit, you know, a couple notches or so. But the point was, I ended up renting after figuring out that my microphone was hitting its limit in that room. I did end up renting the equipment necessary to measure it properly. And I got lucky. I hit NR15 with the AC on, but that's not normal. And that room, my wife tells me I spent $40,000 in that room. She budgeted it, I didn't. And that's, so yeah, it's pretty expensive to do that.
Yeah, and that's something to consider. If you're going to do something like this to a house, you're not going to get the money back on the house. It's like an indoor pool.
Yeah, I actually did a video where I said I did. So I did on the last house, but I don't think that's normal. I think that we were just lucky.
Well, I've got a client right now who's selling an estate home that I did a theater, and it's got like dual jail audio, you know, Fathoms and Clips THX, and I mean he's selling the system with it. Obviously, he's not going to get it what it costs and what the client has into it, but he's selling it because he's like, oh man, it's upgrade time. Woo.
So this slide kind of reiterates things that we've said a bunch of times. So I'm going to skip through most of it, but I'll just restate something I said earlier, which is that I really don't personally believe that it's possible to treat a normal small room so that it sounds like a large room, so that it sounds like the original performance space. I think that the best it can do is aid in that illusion a little bit, and it's a good thing. But I've said this before. I've talked to Sean about it before a lot too, Sean Olive, and he seems to always agree with me on this. So I'm going to say I think that it's fair to say that this is true. Gene, you've said it's true too.
Yeah. Sean's a cool guy, by the way. Sean's a really cool guy.
Very cool guy. So when I've talked to him about like, well, all right, are we trying to make the room recreate, for instance, the large symphony space or a rock concert or whatever? I mean, are we really trying to make the room do that? Is that even possible? And my argument has been, I don't think it is. I just don't think you can do that. What I do think you can do is use surround speakers to recreate that, and that's a much more accurate way. And it's because the reflections in those other types of spaces are just so dramatically different from what's in a small room that it doesn't make a lot of sense that the small room's ever going to really sound just like that big space. So
well, I have a way everybody can make their small room sound larger. Just engage one of the German bathtub DSP modes of the Yamaha receiver. Yeah. There you go. Boom.
And that's exactly what that's doing. That's actually taking the sound and overlaying essentially the impulse response of a very large space. So you're getting a ton of reverb that wouldn't, I mean, in a small room like ours, there is no reverb. There is never a point in time where the reflections become just random. And they tend to always be strong and still somewhat directional. So, yeah, I mean, it's basically, I don't think a small room's ever going to sound like a large room. And if that's what you're really trying to achieve, you need some sort of a surround system.
Yeah.
All right. So the disconnect between the standard rooms and the ideal listening room. So as I mentioned before, the standard listening rooms were really designed for testing, like comparing speakers and electronics, recordings. They were meant as tools for dissecting. Multi-channel systems reproduce the natural acoustics of the original event on their own. They don't need the room. The multi-channel system does that. Sean said something to me when we were talking about this, and I thought it's a really good point, and he's right about that. Most people, even if they have a surround system, are going to listen in 2-channel at some time. And so it makes sense. I don't think that a room can totally recreate the acoustics of a large space, but it makes sense to try to make the room somewhat spacious so that it can at least somewhat aid in that illusion. And so having a totally dead room probably doesn't make sense unless you really are somebody who intends to use an up mixer 100% of the time.
So Matt, there's a formula to that. Sometimes the recording combined with the room can simulate that spaciousness, but it's just, you just got to stumble upon it. You know what I mean? It's not something you can plan out, but you know, yeah. I understand what you're saying.
I'm going to skip this slide. I don't know why I thought you all needed to know this, but
that's a lot of text.
When you go to our Patreon page, you can read that.
Yeah.
All right, so back to Grimani's thing. So I said, wait, what? Grimani's right? A lot of people, for some reason, texted me or messaged me or emailed me and said, did you hear what he said? Is that true?
Dude. And that Grimani's badass, dude. You know he is. He's a good guy. He's an amazing guy.
So very smart. So he said something, though, about this idea of increasing dissimilarity in the lateral reflections would improve the spaciousness of it. And like I said, I was like, I don't know if that's true. I was a little bit surprised that there would be much research on that. And I couldn't find the research study he had mentioned. He couldn't remember the name of it. But I did recently find something that supports this idea. Now, I mean, the research they did actually used identical diffusers on both sides. So you might argue that you don't need to have two different surfaces, but the core finding of that research was that if the phase was different in the left and right ear, the room sounded bigger. And the more different the phase was, the bigger the room sounded. And so whether you do that with just normal diffusers or you have an absorber on one side and a diffuser on the other, they're both going to achieve that goal, but it makes sense that the absorber on the left and the diffuser on the right in a particular location on the wall is going to have more dissimilarity to it than if it's two diffusers right by each other. So I don't think it's a crazy idea. I think, Gene, we talked about this. We're going to try it because I'm really curious what it sounds like.
I would wonder if you can make a speaker that can test that. You know, you have the drivers on the side of the cabinets. Either you fire them in phase versus one out of phase. If you would hear a difference in spaciousness by doing that.
Probably. So the point of all this is I'm not saying that everybody needs to treat their rooms in a certain way. I'm not saying you should do this. What I'm saying is these are good examples of how you might treat a room to change the way it sounds. You want a more spacious room? This is a good way to try to get that. You don't want a spacious room? Don't do this.
Right.
All right. So the last thing I want to say is that Dirac, Odyssey, a lot of people think that these room correction systems completely negate needing to do any sort of acoustic treatment.
God, I'm so Gene, right? Am I right, Gene? I'm
we know installers that think
so.
this.
I have a theater room I'm doing for clients, and they went and bought some products from somebody else, and that person was also an integrator, and he's like, "Oh, you don't need that with ARC processing. You don't need acoustic treatments." And they came to me, and I just looked at them, and my mouth dropped. I'm like, "What? What? How can you mechanically treat above the transitional frequencies with equalization?" But you're right. I'm so glad you said that. Sorry, that's a big pet peeve for me.
Well, and one thing that people need to remember is that probably half of what we've been talking about had nothing to do with the amplitude response of the system. It was about spaciousness. Right. Room correction cannot touch spaciousness. It just has nothing to do with it. And it's not that it couldn't technically. There is a way for that to work. I did a presentation for you before on that, Gene. It's just we're talking about something that's very complicated and doesn't currently exist. All the current systems are what are known as SIMO, single in, multiple out. Mm-hmm. You've got one microphone coming in. I know you're measuring from different locations, but that doesn't matter. It's still one microphone coming in. You're processing it from that one dimension, and then multiple out, left speaker, center speaker, right speaker, subwoofer, etc. But what you're sending to it is you are correcting each of those separately, but you're not doing it in any sort of dynamic way with the intent of changing the sound as it flows through the room. MIMO, multiple in, multiple out DSP systems, could actually do that. So the way to think of that is imagine you've got imagine you've got speakers throughout your room, and the sound waves are traveling through the room. And as they travel through the room, the speakers then start to fire, for instance, sound out of phase in a certain way. You could imagine then that you could have a system that's canceling reflections in certain spots in the room at certain times in order to change the acoustics. So this is essentially DSP-based acoustics. Is this possible? Yes. Actually, Harman has a system. Lexicon developed it. It is not designed for home systems. We are not there yet. This does not exist.
So you would have active mics in the room at all times, basically.
You would. There is theoretically a way to do it without the active mics, and there is a Dirac actually had worked on this, but last I heard the project was on ice, so I don't know that it's coming. And they were working on it for cars, not homes, so I don't know that it was going to come to homes anytime soon. And it was going to be, because I remember when they told me about this and they described it, it was like one of those, well, how would a consumer do that? And they're like, oh, this isn't for consumers. So the other thing is this would be something that only a custom installer trained in how to do this would do. And part of it is because you have to have somebody come in and install the speakers in the right place. Yeah. And Don's laughing. I mean, I'm guessing, could you imagine the training requirements that it would take?
Probably 6 people in the whole world that could do it.
But listen, it's not so much just the training requirements. It's for people to be willing to pay the price of paying somebody to do it. You understand what I'm saying? That there's a lot of time and a lot of training and expertise goes into this, and you have to pay for it. It's just like my friend Jason Dustle, which you'll get to know Jason, Matt. He's your equivalent on video, and just finding people willing to pay the amount of money to do this calibration. It does amazing things, but you have to be able to financially do it. You can't just do it from a DVD. People think they can, but they can't.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm just going to recap this. I know we spent probably too much time beating this dead horse, but I just want to make clear what we were trying to say here throughout the video for those who have fallen asleep. These ITU, IEC, AES, et cetera standards, they really were not intended to be ideal listening rooms for consumers. That they were not trying to recreate what you should put in your home, and they're not something you necessarily should be targeting. They were designed to be tools for dissecting music. Achieving these standards is really hard to do. So even if it is something you want, I think that it's probably a waste of money. I mean, again, if somebody said to you, well, you can spend $40,000 to get a really low noise floor and achieve all of this, or you could buy a cooler set of speakers, I would be the first to tell you, you should be putting that money towards speakers. And you can treat a pretty normal room to sound really good, not try to follow all the other aspects of the standards that don't matter, especially the quietness. That's a really tough one to achieve that I think just doesn't matter for a lot of people. I mean, I like to do it. I like a quiet room. Gene, you do too. A lot of it is I want to be able to watch movies like really loud and not have my wife yell at me.
Yeah, exactly.
Most consumer rooms are far too small to meet the standards themselves. So you've got a big room. I know, Don, you're saying that's like an ideal size, but being
it's
realistic.
A good size.
I'm just saying, being realistic.
I wish
lot of
the
people
ceilings
don't
were higher. No, they don't, but it's not necessarily that uncommon. But I think with the whole idea, Matt, when Gene and I first talked about this, year and a half ago, Gene, 2 years ago, about building the ultimate smart home, and we use that smart home term loosely because the automation would make it smart, but I'm talking about having the ideal theater room, having the open architecture family room, having a master bedroom, having audio in the lanai, having audio in the front entrance, having audio in your kids' room. These are things that people want to do. So now we have almost a laboratory to experiment and do this and share what we're doing and what we're learning. Listen, I've been an integrator for almost 30 years. I don't know everything. I mean, I get frustrated with people because they think I'm an idiot because I don't follow all this and that. I work from experience, and that's something we should talk about another time. But I learn all the time. Meeting you and getting to know you, Matt, and also Anthony. And you guys are brilliant. The things that you talk about are amazing, and it's all interweaving to what I do professionally. And I just want people to understand what they're getting from Audioholics with you guys. I mean, it's crazy. I'm just here to go, nah, that shit ain't gonna work because we do that. And obviously I'm not good looking and I cuss too much and I drink too much.
Is true.
Well, I mean, I'm a dude, but I do this every day, and I do ultra high-end homes. I'm doing the third largest home in America, the theater for it. It's 132,000 square feet. So I do this on a real world. People pay me to do it, but I still learn. I'm adjusting what I do professionally based on what you guys do. And what I like about you and Anthony is you're not so caught up in your knowledge. You're like, no, you live in the real world too. And this is great stuff. I'm excited to see for Audioholics and all the people that follow Audioholics and do the Patreon where this is going to go, because this is so much different than what we did even 10 years ago, Matt, like, the standards.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm stopping the sharing now because I think we're done with the show part of it, if you will, the presentation. But I think what you said is right, Don. I mean, you and I have talked about this before. One of the problems with some of the theoretical stuff is that when you do go to put it into a room, it's not uncommon. Oh, I'm sorry. My dog is having a fit over there.
You need help? Should we call 911?
Mr. Fluff, what are you doing? He's going after the cat. We're on video. Cat is going after him.
Are those Beats headphones? If they are, I'm going to hit you in the mouth when I see you.
No, these are. Somebody asked about these. I don't even remember the brand. There's some. Yeah. They're like the Martin Logan of headphones. They were like electrostatic and
really?
Dynamic. Yeah, and they broke on me. So like one channel doesn't work and the other does.
So these are the new B&W PX7s, which are one of our products of the year at Audioholics.
And they can purchase them at
www. I don't know.
Well, we have Amazon links on. Yeah,
we have
did the
Amazon
review
links,
on those. Yeah,
that's great headphones. You should get some, Matt.
I should.
I've had about 5 companies send Matt headphones now, so he's going to be pretty loaded pretty soon.
They're nothing that good though, but it'll be interesting to compare. I'm actually going to bring them up to your house, Gene, so we can see how they compare with some of these others.
What I mean, I'm trying not to be ingratiating, but Matthew Poes is one of them. I mean, and Gramani too. You guys are, I'm telling you, from somebody who's a professional and does it all the time, I'm listening to what you're saying intently. I'm like, wow, this is amazing information. It really is. And I'm grateful. I just wanted to throw that out there.
So speaking of which, Gene, somebody on the YouTube had said I need a raise. I think.
Yeah. Don, okay.
Yeah. He absolutely needs a raise.
I'll take it out of Don's paycheck. So
yeah,
at the end of the day, that's what's funny about it. At the end of the day, is there an ideal room? How do we recap this for someone that doesn't want to sit on an hour presentation here? I think the answer is no, because it really depends on how you're going to use that room, and it's very subjective. It's not. Getting the room to sound right is not as objective as we all were, as we know the objective facts about loudspeakers and how they should measure, how we can predict how they would sound based on measurements. But to some extent, the room is still a very subjective space, and it's the most contributing factor to what you're going to hear with all that equipment in there anyway.
Yeah, I mean, after the speakers, but yes, the speakers typically are the number one thing in a room that's going to affect sound. The room is number two, although we tend to just treat it like a constant. In a way it is, because what are you going to do with it? But this idea that there's some perfect room that everybody needs to try to make their room like, I think is silly. I think at the end of the day, it really is more about getting something that you like with the equipment you have. And there are, like your space, there's reasons to treat rooms really well, but there are a lot of people who are, I don't know, in the real world with a system in their living room, and that's just not. You good now, Don?
I was wondering where you went.
Well,
I thought maybe Matt's dog got to you or
I'm
something.
51 years old. Once you break the seal, I'm just saying. You don't know, Matt. You're still young.
So yeah, at the end of the day, I don't think that there's an ideal room, and I think the point why I wanted to do this is I just didn't want people to feel like they needed to chase that dragon in order to enjoy music. You know, it's not
such a great video. No, you're absolutely right. There's no ideal room. Each room is independent and different. You know, a lot of what we do here in Florida, we have open great rooms like you have, Gene, where the family room and the kitchen are all open. It's an open space. A lot of times, you know, in years past, guys would do a 5.1 or 7.1 system in the ceiling. I hate that. I think that's
fancy.
I don't care what any manufacturer says. You're never going to get the same sound. So, you know, we were doing on-wall speakers around the TV, sometimes in walls if we could. We actually use a lot of sound bars now, and there are companies like Leon and Triad, and the list goes on, that are making absolutely unbelievably well-sounding sound bars that
passive, especially.
Well, and they're crossed over and designed in such a way that they expand way past the width of an 85-inch TV or whatever. They really do. If people could just hear them. And one of the reasons I wanted to do this with Gene is expose a bunch of our products that integration companies make that are solutions that help people solve problems. Is all, you know, that's one of the main reasons I'm here.
Yeah.
So we have a
quick question. Actually, is a good one to address. Excuse me.
Yeah, that's the one I was going to tell you to bring up. So what rooms do they use? So you know what? I've been to a couple of manufacturers' spaces before. I'll tell you, so a lot of manufacturers are in, even if their speakers aren't made on site, you know, like if their headquarters is here, for instance, but the speakers are made in China or something like that, the headquarters will have listening rooms, and they'll do a lot of R&D there and things like that. And so what they typically are is a commercial space. So the first problem you got to know about these spaces is they're not really like your home. So what they're trying to do is turn some office they have often into something that's a little bit more like a normal home. But they've got a couple of acoustic advantages. First off, they're usually larger than a typical listening room. Second, they have an acoustic ceiling, which is a drop ceiling. Now, people might think, well, that sucks, right? That's terrible. Actually, from an acoustic standpoint, it is amazing because it tends to absorb all of that bass reflection that you normally get off of a drywall ceiling. So if you ever measure a room like that, what you'll see is that you don't get some of the SBIR effects that you typically get from the ceiling floor bounce. The ceiling bounce is gone. So, you know, what I've noticed is they're basically setting up a system in an office. It's not really that much like a home, but they're doing their best to make it like it. Now, I've also seen people set up listening rooms in their spaces that are like, it's like a warehouse, and I don't know what they're thinking. Like, it sounds awful there. The RDT is probably is a true RT60 at like 3-4 seconds, and you know, so it seems to be all over the place.
Yeah, and you know, I've been to at least a half dozen, probably a dozen different loudspeaker companies doing on location tours and seeing their whole design process. And it is interesting to see every company kind of does things differently. I've been to one, which I won't mention names, but it was in Canada. The guy was really set on listening to speakers in really bright rooms. Like, he didn't believe in acoustic treatments. He had glass walls, you know, vaulted ceilings. And when I listened, I could tell everything was just scattered, like there was no focus. And it kind of made me realize, well, I wonder if someone's voicing a speaker in these kind of rooms, could that be responsible as to why we get speakers sometimes that don't measure as good as they should, or they don't sound as good as they should because they're not being analyzed in a realistically good sounding room, you know?
Yeah.
Even though they can measure them anechoic, but if they're voicing it for a room that's so overly bright with such a long decay time, I think that could compromise the sound when you're trying to do something in a decent
If I
size.
were a speaker company and manufacturer, I would, besides having an anechoic chamber and measurements, I would have like an office or an area with multiple venues to play my speakers and measure them in, and then kind of sum everything so that holistically sounds good in whatever environment that it's in. I mean, I don't know if people do that, but I mean, that's something I would do. I have designed and sold the same identical speaker deployment and put it in 2, 3, 4 different rooms and had 4 different sounds completely. Rooms where it was frustrating, we couldn't achieve it. Some rooms where we put it in and it was just magic. I mean, what Matthew's saying is so true.
You're talking about this, that synergistic interaction between the speaker and the room.
Absolutely, because I mean, every room's different. And that's what frustrates me about some people that do reviews is they take the same speaker and put it in their same environment that they listen to and have this big diatribe about this and that. But you know what? Take that speaker and put it in 4 different rooms and see how it sounds. That's the only real way to do it. That's where experience comes in. What upsets me is that people buy products based on these influencers who really don't. It's limited. It's not a true representation.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
you know, another interesting experiment that we're probably going to be doing is in my neighborhood. My neighbor built the identical house to me, pretty much the same house, except I went into his family room, and his family room was so bad, like with echo, and just did not sound like my family room system. Sounds amazing. You could have a conversation in there. I put a diffused wall behind the TV, and I think that really helped. His whole house has travertine floors. He's got like modern furniture with glass everywhere. And it's going to be a challenge to get, even if I put my identical system there, it would sound really bad in that room. And it's a challenge to get people to understand this. Like I was trying to explain to the guy and his family that no matter what we put in this room, it's going to be at a disadvantage because of the way the room sounds right now. If you can't have a good conversation in a room without it being echoey, what chance does your speakers have to reproduce sound accurately? And the first thing his wife was like, well, we don't have to put anything ugly on walls, or what do we have to do? And I'm like, no, we could find other alternatives. But most people don't even think about it at all. They just want to get, spend $20,000, $30,000 on equipment and put it in a room that sounds bad.
Yeah, and that's, I think, where you get into rooms that do need to be treated. So I think I was mentioning earlier, there are rooms out there. I think Anthony said that to Eugene, or somebody said that recently, that was saying, like, sometimes you just get lucky. You get these rooms that sound really good and you don't need to do a lot to them. I mean, Floyd used to talk about that, and I used to believe it because when I had measured my first, let's say, 50 rooms, probably 90% of them fell within that 0.2 to 0.5 second RTD. They sounded okay, and it's like, yeah, I can see why you wouldn't need to do a whole lot to this room. And then I started measuring more and more rooms, and all of a sudden I was getting those 1.8 second rooms, and the ones that were very unusual, or the one you're describing. I bet if we measured that room, it would have a pretty high RDT time. I bet you we would find a lot of reflection problems in there. So those are spaces where it's like, yeah, okay, now putting a bookcase in here, putting a rug on the floor, that's not going to fix it. It's going to need more than that. So this room that I'm treating that's got the really high time, we actually are putting in, I'd have to go back and look at what the total count was at the end, but I think he's already got 6 2-inch panels installed on the walls. We've got some picture panels down. I think you were talking about those earlier. They are really cool looking, but they're basically like, cool posters or artwork that are printed on acoustically transparent fabric, put over a 2-inch panel. We've got, I think there's 2 of those that are going to go in. And when I say panels, I don't mean 2x4 panels. These are typically somewhere between 4 and 6 feet wide, and they're all about 9 to 10 feet tall. So these are unusually big panels too.
Wow.
And it's taking
9 to 10 feet tall.
Yeah, well, it's a huge room. So it's taking, so as I said, we're at 1.2 seconds right now, and that's after we've put in about 9 panels.
Wow.
So I mean, just to give you an idea of like how much absorption you sometimes have to add. When rooms are really bad, you got to treat them, and you just got to know how to treat them right. And actually, I think the trick for doing it well, and this is always a balancing act between budget and what people will tolerate, but is trying to make it not look bad, right? Like take your neighbor's room. I bet if I go to that guy and I say, I want to cover every surface, including your ceiling, with 2-inch panels, and it's going to be covered in this ugly burlap fabric, he's going to say, no, thank you.
Yeah.
So
for sure.
how do you make his room sound better so that, you know, add the absorption and add the diffusion that's necessary without making the thing ugly? The diffusion's easy. But,
well, he needs some big, massive couches, because when you add mass to a room, that's going to take care of a lot of that too.
Well, couches are good absorbers.
It does to a point. It's like people saying adding carpet to a room. It does to a point.
Yeah.
Remember when you were going to carpet your room and we talked about doing from an aesthetic standpoint, we can put a rug down, but Anthony, and we're treating him with acoustical treatments. You don't have to do rugs in a room.
Yeah, exactly.
When it comes to the floor and ceiling of rooms, you can treat them as interchangeable in the sense that you can carpet your floor, or you can leave it hard and you can treat the ceiling.
Right.
And in a lot of cases, it's actually desirable to leave the floor hard like you did. So aesthetically, it looks really nice, and then treat the ceiling, which is what you're doing.
Yeah. Yep. All right, guys. I think we are wrapped up for tonight. It is past Donnie's bedtime.
Oh, whatever, dude. I'm a vampire, bitch.
Yeah,
past my bedtime. Past Matt's bedtime. He's in babyland.
That's true.
Matt's,
well, I got the Storm audio processor I'm going to be measuring tonight, or
that's a beautiful piece of hardware, man.
Yep.
So I just want to say we have some exciting. We're getting ready to start the final installation on the Ultimate Smart House, the Audioholics Smart House. Yep. That's a big deal, and we're going to have we're going to have Matthew up here real soon, right? We're going to do do some measurements. Well, I mean, it's an hour and a half drive, dude. An hour drive. But and we're going to
it's an hour and 45 minutes. I've had to do it already.
Yeah, but it's not
because he drives like 40 miles an hour, dude.
I have a spare bedroom. You can crash with us, Matt, and we'll hang out and make a great dinner and watch movies. But your wife would probably cut me if we did that. But listen, we have some exciting stuff coming up really, really soon. We're going to do a lot of video, because the Audioholics Smart Home has an incredible amount of technology. It really is a representation of everything that's possible now in home technology: lighting control, distributed video, world-class audio systems in multiple rooms, distributed audio, HVAC, integrated shade control. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, and then Matt is also building a house too, so we're going to be covering that.
Yeah, Matt's building a really, really cool house. By the way, I love the design of his house. It's going to be great. So we are in the boot. We are in the trenches, boots on the ground, showing you guys how to put it all together in a real house. So that way you can live vicariously through us now, and then eventually build it yourself when you're ready. And I love Northern Georgia, by the way. I just throw that out there. Oh, someone from Georgia? Yeah. Cool. All right, guys. Well, we are done with this broadcast. Don't forget about our Patreon channel at patreon.com/audioholics. Please hit that notification, hit the bell notice, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. If you hit the subscribe button, I'd be really happy if you do that, so we could keep bringing these videos to a larger audience. Thanks, guys. Don, Matt, for being here this late. And until next time, my friends, keep listening.